How can we make the world better? By making ourselves better. The Dr. Joe Show explores how you can make positive personal change by using his groundbreaking and highly effective I Am approach to understand who we are and why we do what we do. Your small changes can have big effects.
Join us now for the Dr. Joe Show with Mark Stiles of Stiles Law, Thomas McCoy, and your host, Dr. Joe Schrand.
Welcome to the Dr. Joe Show.
Thunderous applause. Thunderous applause. And well deserved, Mark. Wow, Larry. Woo, that's incredible. I never knew Larry could make that.
They love you. They love you, Dr. Joe. They all love you.
Oh, I think it's about your introduction. I don't think it's...
Oh, no, this is the Dr. Joe Show. They are cheering for you, my friend.
Nice of you. Thank you so much, Mark. Taps right into our guest for tonight because she certainly is a creator, created shows for other people. Her dad was a creator. Tom, can you introduce our guest for tonight, please?
Yeah. Dr. Joe. Our guest was born in the Netherlands and was dancing as soon as she learned to walk. After moving to New York City, she became the youngest apprentice in the Dance Theater of Harlem and quickly moved on to become a featured dancer in the Emmy Award-winning television special Blues and Gone. After appearing as a dancer in the Francis Ford Coppola film The Cotton Club, she graduated from Carnegie Mellon University, moved to Europe, and continued her dance career. Upon her return to the States, she teamed with Peter Wise and Associates and began casting national commercials and theater productions like the Broadway smash hit Smokey Joe's Cafe. In addition to writing a full-length musical, a narrative tribute of her father's contribution for PBS television, and contributions to the books Before I Got Here, The Wondrous Things We Hear When We Listen to the Souls of Our Children, and Not in My Family, AIDS in the African-American Community. She joyously celebrates life with her husband and 2 children. Welcome back to the Dr. Joe Show, Alexis Wilson.
Yeah, welcome back, Alexis Wilson.
Nice to be here.
It is great having you. So, how have things been since we chatted last? We saw each other in June for the 50th anniversary of Zoom. What's been going on?
Life just keeps rolling along.
Yeah.
Well, I've been working on a production that I just finished with high school kids, drama, for BIPOC kids, Black kids and kids of color. We created an additional piece to a drama department, a wonderful drama department here where I live. So I finished that. And then I also recently got hired by Denison University to be the career coach for the visual, written, and performing arts, which they didn't have before. So that's a brand new gig that I started March or April or something.
No, that's
so
great.
I'm still trying to get my sea legs.
Yeah.
So that's been keeping me busy.
I bet it has. And just so people understand some of the history here, Alexis' dad, Billy Wilson, was the choreographer for Zoom, which was a TV show that I happened to be part of. So I knew Billy 50 years ago, an incredible, dynamic human being who just brought joy, really. And I'm not just saying this. It was joyous to work with him. And he was creative and gave us all sorts of room to be creative ourselves. And I wanted Alexis to come on tonight because she's written a book, Not So Black and White, and it's a memoir. And I wonder whether we can just start just by talking about the title, because these days, Not So Black and White may have a different connotation than what you're really talking about in the book.
Yeah, so I think most people, when they see the title or they think of the phrase "not so black and white," and especially if they see me and know anything about me, then they're thinking about my black and whiteness, since my mother is white, Dutch, and my father was African American. But it's actually about sort of the space between the bars. It's really the gray of life, and that it took me a long time through just growing up and maturing to see that the world is not always as stark and sort of obsolete in those terms, either this or that. And it also has to do with love. And as James Baldwin said, love is where you find it. You don't always know where that's coming from, what package it's wrapped in, what it looks like or sounds like, or any of those things. But then, of course, it's up to you to accept or, or turn away that love that's coming to you. But the point is that these are all things that you think you have a handle on, but then you realize that life is more complicated than that.
Mm. And you wrote the book about, 10 years ago? What inspired you to write at that point?
Well, so 2013, I think, is when the book was published, 2012, 2013. And it took me 10 years I gave myself 10 years because we were just starting our family. But what had happened was the night that my father died, at St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, which actually doesn't even exist anymore. I was there with my husband, my brother, a dear friend of the family, and another dear friend of the family, Arthur Mitchell, who was co-founder of Dance Theater of Harlem and very important in my life and a dear friend of my father's. And we were all there. And Mr. Mitchell and I were standing in the hallway, or just outside of his room after he passed. We all sort of had our moment. And he said to me, "So what are you going to do now, Holly?" Which is my nickname. And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, you should write your father's biography." And I said, "I will," not knowing what that meant, or, and then when I started to write the book, I started out that way, but it didn't feel like mine. I didn't want to write sort of the ABC kind of, book. And maybe that still needs to happen. And I don't, whether that's me or someone else, but what happened was it sort of morphed more into my story with my father and this sort of unusual life that we had, that I had growing up with him.
And it starts off with you on an airplane.
Yep. And
you were going back to the Netherlands?
I was going back to the Netherlands because I happened to be online, and I saw that there was a Dutch production of Bubbling Brown Sugar being done in Amsterdam. And I've been the executrix of my father's estate, so I'm in charge of all the work. And I knew nothing about this. So I was kind of curious because they'd done a whole tour. And this was the end of the tour. And so I decided that I was going to get on a plane and just sort of make my presence known. I couldn't go to the mattresses. I didn't have that kind of financial wherewithal to just hire attorneys and make a whole drama of it. But I want to at least let them know that I was still here and that the correct thing would have been to at least contact me. So that's how that began. And then it ends that way, which actually wasn't the original beginning of the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For a long time, the book started sort of at the 11th clock number in the book, which is Chip running through the street with that Afghan over his head. He's having this mental breakdown and running on 7th Avenue in the middle of the night. And we're trying to get him back into St. Vincent's Hospital after he had escaped, or I should say, got out of that hospital. And it's just a crazy, crazy night. And that's how the book started. I see things very cinematically. So I wanted to do something that was a little more interesting than sort of the sort of logical kind of way in terms of, right sequence that you would imagine, based on years or something like that. But then after a while, I had spoken to an agent, and I really respected her. And she said, "I don't know, it's something about the structure." She said, "You might just want to try doing it in a linear way." And so I took a summer and I did it that way. And I realized, pardon me, that yes, this was better because it didn't make the reader work as hard with a kind of flashback and things moving all around.
But what we were talking about off air was, I was asking Alexis, because she's been interviewed. You've been interviewed many, many times, and I did ask, was there a question that nobody had asked that you kind of wish they had? So that's my question.
Yeah. So I was saying to you that I guess I was surprised that more people didn't ask a little bit more about how I dealt with or responded to my father and Chip.
So let's do some table setting for this then, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we can get deeper into that. Why don't you just give us a basic overview of the book and how you start talking about your mom and why you talk about your mom and where you go from there. And then we'll get into this deeper part about Billy and Chip.
So, as I said, it's about my life growing up with my father. My parents, you mean going back to sort of how my parents met or
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So my parents met, my father was in the London tour of West Side Story with Chita Rivera, dancer in the chorus. And my mother was a baby ballerina with the National Ballet of Holland, Dutch National Ballet.
And he's African American, and she was white. And
she still is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so only because she's still with us and my father isn't. So the directress, Madame Sonia Gaskell of the Dutch National, saw the show, West Side Story, and saw my father in the show and invited him to dance as a soloist. And that's how he came to Holland and danced with my mother. And they became ballet stars together. And they were very arresting looking, gorgeous, and had an incredibly celebrated life together. They fell in love, they married. I was born there in The Hague.
And he was already married, is that right?
He was originally married. At 19, he got married to a girl from Philadelphia. But it seemed like that was never really going to happen. Mm-hmm. And he actually told me a story of how he had been trying to get her to come over to Holland. And she kept saying, no, for whatever reason. And after seeing my mother, he gave her one last call and she still said no. And then he decided he would go that way. So, so then fast forward, we're into sort of the mid 60s and my father is feeling pulled to come back to the States. We're in the Black Revolution and all that's happening here. And he feels like he doesn't want to experience that by proxy and so wants to be back home during that time of important change. So he wants to secure a job before we all come there. I'd just been born. I was weeks old. And he got a job heading the dance department at Brandeis University. And then my mother came with me, Tiny, to Waltham, Mass. And she left everything behind, right? She left her family, her country, her language, a very protected ballet world and all that she knew and all of that, that was so celebrated, to follow this Black man back to the States in the mid 60s to Massachusetts, by the way, a hotbed of what was happening there. So first Waltham, then they went back to Europe, all of us for a little bit, and ended up coming back in 69 and staying. Then moved to Boston, and they started their own ballet company called the Dance Theatre Boston. My brother Parker was born 5 years later. By that time, things were sort of getting rocky in the marriage. And they separate after Zoom. After he choreographed Zoom, he got a call from New York, because by this time and with the company, he was choreographing more and more and started to dance less and less. And he got a company from The Odyssey, starring Yul Brynner and Joan Diener, and that was the first Broadway show that brought him to Broadway. And by that time, things were finished. So when they sat down to talk about what was going to happen with us, my mother really surprised everybody and said, even her own attorney, and said, you take them, you take the children.
Wow.
Which never would have happened at that time in Boston, Mass, that this Black man would have full custody of 2 young children, only because my mother said, you take them. So he did, and by then he had
Can
fallen.
I just stop there just for a minute?
Yeah.
So how old were you at that point, Alexis?
So when my parents divorced, I was 11.
So there was some awareness that your mom would say, you take them.
Yeah, I think she was aware.
And what about for you? What was that like for you?
Oh, for me, it was a different time, right? And we didn't talk about those things then, right? Like we do now. The conversations that I have with my children, especially when they were even much younger, were already very different than you had in the 70s. Whether you were talking about, private issues, whether it was what was happening in a marriage, or definitely not with, same-sex marriage or anything like that. So we didn't sort of know what was happening. I don't remember really a moment that, and I think my father probably did have that moment of sitting us down in some way, just knowing my father, but I don't remember that moment. And by that time, he'd fallen in love with Chip. After the Odyssey, he choreographed Bubbling Brown Sugar, which was his biggest commercial hit on Broadway. He choreographed 8 shows for Broadway and 3 Tony nominations. And so in auditions for Bubbling Brown Sugar, the last man to walk in an audition at the end of a very long day was this 6'3", gorgeous Black man with this silky baritone voice, Chip Garnett. They hired him, and that was the person that my father would fall in love with after my mother. And so he was then in New York. He and Chip lived in New York, and my brother and I would come, I don't know, was it every week, every other week? We would be the only children on the plane. The children weren't on planes then, and the what do you call, not the waitress, the
stewardess.
The stewardess would come and sit with us, as they used to do when children were on the plane, and it became sort of our normal to be on this plane, and then we'd, come back. And then when that happened, when they sat down about the divorce, then we moved to New York and lived with Chip and my father. And
were you aware what Broadway meant at that point? I mean, because this show was on Broadway.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think I was certainly aware of what Broadway meant. I mean, even when my father was doing the Odyssey, one of my most vivid memories is actually meeting Yul Brynner backstage. And throughout our growing up, my father brought us into everything that he did. Every rehearsal process, audition process, opening nights. He would often ask me what I thought about certain things. So we were always very involved and welcome in his process of creating. So we grew up running through the house and, flipping on the seats of all of the theaters, So we knew what that was, and he made sure that we sort of knew who, what that was and who these artists were, and how special they were, and all of those things, and the history behind it. And then at that time, at 11, books. My father was a voracious reader and finally got me to read. And then he'd given me a diary. And I've kept a journal, which I write in every morning, almost, of my life. I have them all over the place since then. And so instead of talking about things the way we do a little bit more of today, that became the repository for everything that I didn't understand and was confused about. Because at that time, Chip was either introduced as my father's friend or sometimes uncle. And that's what it was, And when my mother, sort of walked away in that way to take full responsibility of us, she completely walked out of my life. So I've only seen her 4 times in about 40 years. And that's the story that I'm working on now. So at that time, that's when I decided that I wanted to dance seriously. So it was writing and reading, and then I wanted to go into ballet. And I'd been around it since I was born. They would bring me in a basket and sit me in all their studios. So it was always a part of my life. And even when they had their own school, I would take classes, but I wasn't really serious then. But when that change happened and we moved to come to live with my father, which I adored my father. My father was everything to me. So that was a great part about what was happening. And my mother had been unraveling when things started to change. We left our beautiful brick brownstone on West Brookline Street and moved into an apartment. And she was, just not present. And so I would find ways to also not be present by spending time with a friend of mine. And
I can very much understand what that must have been like for you to have a parent who was not present.
And an admitted journalist every single day. I'd love to talk about that a little bit. I've always been tempted to journal, and I'd start a little bit and then I'd stop, but you've been doing it all your life. That is amazing.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what got me through a lot of things that I didn't understand at that age when we weren't talking about those things in the 70s, And I'm glad that I was introduced to that I had that. And so as a result of doing it all these years, I rarely go a day. And when I do, I feel off.
Wow.
Because it really, it's sort of my juice, like my coffee, the way that I kind of just get started. I don't know any other way to say it, and then sometimes I do at night, not always, but the important thing for me is the morning because I'm a morning person. So
that's how you start your day, by journaling? Yep. And is it the thoughts of the day before, the thoughts of the day forward, the thoughts of
all the above? If there's something that's stuck out, then it becomes that, or just a kind of list. One of the things that it does for me is I'm a very in my head kind of person. Yeah. So it allows me, and since I don't dance anymore, another way of just getting it out, like therapy. It really was. It has been a kind of therapy for me.
Yeah, you say you weren't really talking about it, but you were talking with your pen, and somebody was listening. That's really cool. Dr. Joji, is that a strategy that you talk with a lot of patients of the benefits of journaling?
Absolutely. Because once you get into the habit of it, I think as Alexis is saying, it really becomes so cathartic every day that you get to just sort of express yourself. And what's different about it than talking is you don't need to share it with anyone if you don't want to.
Right.
And edit.
Right. Say.
No, I was just saying you don't have to edit or censor. That's the idea of it. You're just like, if that's what you want to do, or sometimes you're feeling very, pretty and you write that, but it's up to whatever you feel like you want to do and not thinking about anyone else reading it.
Yeah. And there are so many stories that we have every day that we can write. Tom, you're a writer as well.
Sure. I'm not much of a journaler. I guess you could say I self-edit too much, I'd say, to be a journal keeper. I always have to writing whether it's a tweet or a text, I always have to make sure it's like, is this worth someone reading?
But isn't that the whole point of journaling, right? Posting it on Twitter or what have you, you're publishing it. Here, you're really just putting your thoughts on paper and kind of
Because I'm actually like you, Tom. I'm very meticulous and like to do things correctly, especially when it comes to writing. And grammar is actually not my strong suit. So that's a place where I finally don't have to think about those things and write in my crazy backwards way that I write. And people say, that doesn't make any sense. You put in the verb at the end or whatever it is. I don't know.
So did you bring some of your journaling into Not So Black and White? Or was that a different writing process for you?
So after my father died, I have a very dear friend, Gabri Krista, who's a dancer and choreographer. And she gave me a book called Wild Mind by Natalie Goldberg. And Natalie Goldberg is really the woman who kind of cracked wide open daily writing practice through prompts, that she gives, and also, a great writer. And so for 2 years, I did only daily writing practice before I even started working on the book. And then I would follow Natalie because she then was still in New York, and I'd go to her workshops. And then later I would follow her to Taos and do like silent writing retreats and things like that. She's really special. So yes, that helped me to, for lack of an overused phrase, peel the onion, how to sort of go deeper and closer to what we try to do sometimes in memoir is get to that place, and that really served me. And I continue to use it. And I can't tell you how many times I've given so many books to other writers and other people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. To go back to the story, then we were at the part where your dad had just met Chip. Mm-hmm. How did that have an influence on you? Did you have some sense of what was going on as you're going back and forth from Waltham to New York? And
the relationship and my father living with this man at that time was very confusing. And because of the lack of conversation, and I did everything I could to get him gone. I was awful. I was really awful.
There was a conflict between you and Chip.
Yes, because I told you I adored my father, and it was I always think about Eugene O'Neill's Morning Becomes Electra, which is about the daughter and the wife who are vying for the attention of the husband and father. And it was sort of that similar kind of feeling. But what I came to realize, I thought Chip was my nemesis, my Achilles heel, that everything in my life was because of this man. And what was this, And my father there's actually a moment in the book where my father and I have a moment. And I think I'll never find anyone in my life. And I think I'll always be alone. I'm in college. And my father sits me down and we have a conversation. And I don't want to talk, but he knows me. And he goes, come sit. And he said, why are you crying? I was crying uncontrollably. And he said, why? What's wrong? What's going on? And I said, I can't, I was just crying. He said, no, say, what is it? And I said, well, I feel like I'll never find anyone. He said, well, why would you say that? You're going to find so many wonderful people in your life, and blah, 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 as parents do. And I said, because I don't want to explain Chip. Like I would never bring people home. And he said, well, I can't apologize for Chip. Chip loves you and Parker like his own children, and he would do anything in the world for you.
Parker's your brother.
Parker's my brother. Right. And he said, not everyone's going to like it, but it is what it is. And, this is your home and you should never feel ashamed to come here. So that helped to clarify something, but it wasn't until years later that I realized, with another kind of maturity, that really what I was grappling with and fighting against and why I was being so awful was really the absence of my biological mother. Because Chip came to the table with nothing but love. He and my father were 10 years apart, and Chip walked into the middle of a very awful divorce with these two young children, and he never walked away. Never.
On page 62 of your book, you say, it was hard to warm to Chip because of his determination to please and to be accepted.
Mm-hmm.
That's a powerful image, that when somebody was trying so hard to please and be accepted, did you not believe it? Or, I mean, why was that so hard? And how did that connect with your mom?
I mean, I think, first of all, it was the age. This is like, 11, 12, 13, 14. Didn't have my mother during those important years, but didn't really make that connection. He was that other woman, man, step person that that I just viewed as sort of the evil person. Like I think in my confusion and anger about something that was actually kind of misplaced, I just dumped all of that onto Chip.
And it was, who were you actually angry with then?
Well, I'm saying my mother, the absence of my mother, but it took me a long time to realize that.
And again, that goes back to when you're 11 and she says, no, you take them.
Yeah, you take them and then gone. Now, she and my brother have a very different relationship. They still to this day talk constantly.
Wow.
But I was the one who, from a young age, I would confront her. Those rare moments she'd call on the phone. She'd say, I do all this for you, and all of this is for you and your brother, and I love you, and all of this. And I said, no, you weren't. No, you didn't. No, you aren't. And she would hang up the phone on me from age 10. And she still continues to do it. That's sort of the way that she copes, is by hanging up on me.
So we were talking about the history, and in the book, there's a part that I actually do want to focus on, which is when Chip winds up, it sounds like he has some nervous breakdown. And your dad, who, is this brilliant choreographer, able to, choreography is an incredible art where you basically have a vision, an image of what should move and how they move. It sounds like he felt completely powerless at that moment.
Yeah, he did.
Is that the case? Am I missing something there?
No, that's absolutely the case. Chip had been in Europe in one of my father's shows, a show that I also went into, but I left and then Chip came a night at the Cotton Club in Amsterdam. And this was on the heels of a very disappointing contract with a manager that was supposed to really catapult his singing career. And it didn't happen. And that disappointment was already was setting the tone for what was going to happen. And he went into the show, and there were two people in particular in that company who were just out to sort of undo him. And he was undone, and he had a nervous breakdown overseas, and it was horrible. And that later, we realized that he was diagnosed as being bipolar. And it was very difficult. He was, taping his mouth so that he couldn't speak, and because he couldn't stop the chatter in his mind, and then he couldn't stop talking, and then the bipolar, he was in these manic episodes and would go out and buy 50 hats and 20,000 scarves. And then getting him back to the States was another challenge. Thank God we weren't like locked down with security the way we are today, because that would have been a whole other thing. He had to be tranquilized to get on that plane. But yeah, that was the moment. And it actually happened the last time that we were all together before I came back to the States. We were in Amsterdam, and we all had a Chinese, went to a Chinese restaurant together upstairs. We were like the only ones there. And Chip was seeing demons and spirits and, made up, and thought he was Michael Jackson with like a glove on his hand. And we were just trying to get through the meal. And at the end of the meal, my brother Parker and Chip went downstairs, and my father just looked at me and dissolved and was like, how am I going to get through this? And it was really in that moment was the first time that I'd seen my father, who was like a superhero, that vulnerable in that way.
And it was during that episode that Chip shared a secret.
It was actually when they went back to the States to get the help that he needed. He went into, again, St. Vincent's, but Rice 5, which was the psychiatric wing. And I came back to the States to help them, and my first marriage was falling apart. And Chip was in Rice 5, and we were at home in Jersey, my father's house in Jersey, my brother and my father and I think, or I was in my apartment, and Chip could make a phone call. And they were still trying to get his levels, the medicine leveled. And he was still in a manic moment when he called us. And in this moment, he shared that he and my father had been HIV positive for 10 years, which we had no idea about. We knew how many people were dying, left and right, but we didn't know that Chip and my father were HIV positive, which was incredible at the time that they survived for 10 years. I mean, my father missed the first cocktail in 95. He died in 94. And I have friends to this day who are still here with us because of some of those same cocktails that then, they made better and all of that. So that's how we found out in one of his manic states on that phone. And my father was furious with him.
So did they, how from 1984 to 1994, they were HIV?
No. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. 94 to 90. Yeah.
So what were they doing for treatments back then?
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything but AZT, because AZT was the only thing that was offered. And my father and Chip knew that was off the table. They were not interested in that.
Interesting.
So they went to the Chinese medicine. I mean, anything you can think of. And they both had a doctor, Dr. Paul C. Bellman, in the village at the time. He was called the Pope of Greenwich Village because St. Vincent's Hospital and Dr. Bellman that was the place that you went if you were dealing with AIDS at the time. That was the hospital. And Dr. Bellman was the guy who was helping, who was just trying to do everything he could to get people through this pretty much blindly. So yeah, they tried everything, drinking aloe and stuff that today is like, nothing. But at that time, it was kind of, people weren't doing all that stuff yet.
Right.
I'm just wondering retrospectively whether it was bipolar or whether it was really an HIV-induced psychosis if it was after 10 years.
Right.
Well, I mean, no doubt that was happening at least too, right?
Mm-hmm.
When COVID happened, I immediately went to AIDS because to me there were lots of similarities in the insidiousness of it, the nuance, the what we don't know, the after effects of these things.
So we have so much more to talk about, but we're coming up to the end of time. So the I am approach, we are influenced by 4 domains: the home domain, social domain, biological, and IC domain. Because these domains interact, small changes can have big effects. So, Alexis, based on what we're talking about tonight, what small change can you recommend to our listeners?
What small change that you mean the listeners might have?
No, that you can recommend to them. Yeah, recommend to them based on what we're talking about secrets and.
You know what? It's like, especially in the time that we're living, I feel like it all comes back to such simpler things. And I think of love. I mean, yeah, it's cliche, but it's sort of getting back to that at the end of the day. And again, it's how we started, with this story. And my father is, I think, a great example of how he loved whoever he loved. Be it man, woman, could have been a beautiful plant for my father, but
yeah.
I would say we need more of that. Love's in need of love today. Stevie Wonder, he got it right.
And that sort of leads into the second truth of the I am, that everyone's interested in what you think about them, which has an effect on their brain. So you control no one, you influence everyone. You get to choose. Alexis Wilson, the last 30 seconds. What kind of influence do you want to be?
What kind of influence do I want to be? I guess I hope that I can be an example of creativity and the importance of that. I feel like it's so necessary. The creatives, and I hope that I'm leaving some kindness behind.
Thank you. Alexis Wilson, thank you so much, folks.
My pleasure.
It's incredible. Not so black and white.
Swallow the pill.
Be back next
Did she
week.
do it for love or was she tired of the thrill?